Okay, next up we have Chris from Fremantle Seaweed. Chris, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Ash, and thanks for having me here on Impact Club. So I'll just share my screen and I'm going to get into presentation mode. All right. Um, so my name's Chris Cuyper, founder of Fremantle Seaweed. I'm a seaweed farmer, out on the boat most days. That's one of my long lines, growing Asparagopsis seaweed. So this presentation really is about this amazing Australian seaweed innovation. So it's called Asparagopsis seaweed, and when you feed it to cattle, you reduce cattle methane emissions by 80 to all the way up to 98%, depending on the dosage. It's this, yeah, it's, like I said, it's an innovation from CSIRO. Fortunately, it grows very well here in Australia. Um, so yeah, that's me out on the boat at the seaweed farm with Fremantle in the background. You can kind of see the long lines in that picture, which is how we grow seaweed. Um, the reason I started doing this is I just really wanted to take some climate action. Um, I was so sick of hearing all the negative news, and we need to do everything we can. So I realized I was the right person to take my boat out and start growing seaweed. For us, like we're in this amazing location here in Fremantle, that seaweed farm, like I'm sitting in our office, which is just sort of where all the boats are in the background. So we're really close to accessing the seaweed farm, and we're just the right place to be able to prove up how we can grow Asparagopsis seaweed at scale. So that's the why for me. I, want to take climate action, but we really had to figure out why cattle farmers, being for beef and dairy, also want to take climate action. What's in it for them, and why do they want to reduce their methane emissions? Um, Basically, they're facing all sorts of different pressures, and it kind of follows on well from the good and fugly pitch that you know farmers are just doing it tough. They have pressures from the supermarkets in particular, but then there's consumer pressures, there's financiers also applying pressure, and we need to do everything we can to support them. So Fremantle Seaweed basically exists to be able to help them to decarbonize their operations. The good thing about Asparagopsis seaweed, it also increases the feed conversion ratio. So if a cow is eating Asparagopsis seaweed, it grows to the same weight 7% faster. So they need 7% less food, which has great flow-on effects. So, there's less resources required to grow that food. Um, but that is also very valuable for farmers. That is their biggest cost input for cattle farmers in a beef and feedlot and dairy setting, is the amount of feed that they have to feed to their cattle. Um, so I'm not sure if anyone's aware of this, but cattle make up 5% of global greenhouse gas emissions, which is a significant part of the I guess the pie chart of where all different emissions come from, and that's more than aviation, shipping, and rail combined. So it is a significant amount. And then they're going to have to increase their production by something like 20% leading up to 2050, really as global population increases, but also developing countries, as they become wealthier, are starting to buy more beef and dairy products. Um, so we also have scope 3 targets, for farmers. So this is where we start to look at the pressures on farmers. So supermarkets, banks who are loaning money to farmers have these scope 3 emission targets, and a big part of the emissions in their supply chain, are coming from cattle. We've also seen consumer behavior changing. So there was a study done where it was something like 1 in 4 consumers willing to pay up to 15% more for carbon neutral beef products. Um, and then, like I said as well, a big pressure for them is feed costs, the amount of feed that they have to feed each animal. So I guess why it's good for cattle farmers, reducing their methane emissions, reducing the amount of feed they need, which adds to their profitability. It's a way that they can then fight back against the supermarkets, all the external pressures that they have to try and grow cattle as cheaply as possible with as low as a environmental impact as they can. And if you feed them Asparagopsis seaweed, they actually have something in their toolkit to be able to fight back. So Asparagopsis seaweed is just a supplement. We're not just going to feed cattle 100% seaweed. That would be terrible for them. So 63 grams a day is about 0.5% of what a cow eats. It's really just like having a supplement. You get that 80% reduction. So CSIRO have developed this science. So you've got the scientific might of CSIRO behind it, which is great. And they've settled at 80%, but it depends on the dosage. We get up to 98%, depending on the dosage. But at 63 grams a day, it's 80%. And then they get that 7% increase in the feed conversion efficiency. So for us, we'll be partnering with feedlot and dairy farmers. That's the only place it works at the moment. So we can't target the pastoral cattle, like open range cows that aren't going to the same place to feed. But for feedlot and dairy, where they go to the same place to feed each day, the supplement works really well. Also looking to partner with wholesale feed suppliers. So we're talking to some of the big ones like Milled Feeds to get our product in at that point. So when a cattle farmer orders their feed for the cattle, it's already blended in. Then, had some good feedback from the value chain stakeholders like supermarkets, banks, and the big abattoirs that purchase cattle who have these scope 3 emissions and very little to be able to reduce them at this stage. So a little bit about us, founded in 2020. Then by 2022, we had our seaweed farm, which is that green rectangle in the map, which is only about 5 kilometers south of me here. 2023, we were awarded a $4 million government grant to really commercialise Asparagopsis farming in Western Australia. It took us 4 years to figure out how to grow Asparagopsis seaweed on long lines because it's never been grown in commercial aquaculture equipment before. So there was a fair bit of R&D to figure out the life cycle of the seaweed, how to get it to survive on rope. So we figured that out last year, which was great. We also raised $1.26 million from Birchall, so that was crowdsourced funding. We have 954 shareholders that are awesome and really just want to see climate action and are very supportive of our team, which we got to expand with a scientific and commercial team. This year, accepted into KPMG High Growth Ventures program for a seed round. So we're opening this seed capital raise. I'm calling it the seed round for a seed facility. Our biggest constraint at the moment is getting good, similar to like a terrestrial crop. You do need seeds to grow seaweed. So we need spores to grow seaweed. So we need a facility for that. You can kind of see in the background as microscopes and a fridge with some of our seaweed spores. Like, doesn't really work here in the office. We do need a dedicated facility for that. We also signed a cooperation agreement with Future Feed. I'll go into that a little bit. So CSIRO, when they discovered the fact that Asparagopsis seaweed reduced methane emissions by such a large amount, they commercialized that. And the commercial entity is called Future Feed, which has shareholders being CSIRO, James Cook University, who the two of them own the patent. And then they've got other shareholders, Harvest Road, Woolworths, Meat and Livestock Australia. So it's a commercial entity, and they charge us a royalty to be able to feed Asparagopsis seaweed to cattle. So it's very important we have that agreement in place for Future Feed. I often get asked by investors, is there a way around that global patent they have on the ability to sell Asparagopsis seaweed to cows? And the answer is no. It's sort of the legal might of CSIRO behind it, but it's also important to have them in there because it has a lot of credit for farmers as far as they can say that the science is there, they can show that it's safe and effective against reducing methane. So it is important that they are there. And 3% royalty doesn't really affect our bottom line too much. And for us, we're not out there making sure that the seaweed's safe for farmers and effective, we do need CSIRO in the value chain. Like I said, we're for our next steps looking to fit out a hatchery, nursery, and processing facility. We've identified a location here in Fremantle. We'll also then begin to expand our operations. So we have a 32-hectare seaweed farm here in Fremantle. Roughly 32 hectares would be enough to feed somewhere between 5 and 10,000 head of cattle, which is great, and it's a perfect sort of pilot scale seaweed farm for us. But we really need to expand operations to thousands and tens of thousands of hectares eventually. So we're looking at sites in the Western Australia to do that, which goes into our competitive advantage. So luckily for us here in WA, Asparagopsis Seaweed just grows really well. We get about 10 to 11 months, which is about 5 crops a year here in Fremantle. Our competitors over in South Australia and Tasmania are getting about 2 to 3 months. It's just a shorter growing season. It's all about latitude, really. We're just in that perfect latitudinal band where we get, year-round growth at different locations up and down the West Australian coast. We're also it's a vast coastline, lots of space, access to water without competing interests. So whenever you stake out a seaweed farm in the ocean, everyone will sort of come out of the woodwork or come out of the ocean and say that that's a great place to catch octopus, or that's where I race my sailing boat. So that's a bit of an issue we have here in Fremantle, despite getting approved the seaweed farm. So for us doing it in remote areas, we don't have those issues. First mover advantage in ocean cultivation. So you can grow Asparagopsis seaweed in tanks in an onshore facility, or you can grow it like we're doing in an offshore facility. There's something like 99% of seaweed globally, not just Asparagopsis, but all the different seaweed species, is grown on long lines in the ocean. And really the reason for that is just scale. Like to grow 10,000 head of cattle, Asparagopsis seaweed, similar to what we can grow on the seaweed farm here at 32 hectares, you need about 20 million litres of water in tanks. So it's a lot of water, and that's flow through water. So pumping seawater from the ocean, flowing it through a 20 million litre tank facility and then back out. You have to add nutrients because the seaweed strips out all the nutrients. It's high energy costs to do that, and also quite high contamination. So you have to filter that seawater to quite a fine level. It's something like 10 microns to be able to get out all the contamination. Because otherwise, when you're adding those nutrients in, you're going to grow everything that grows in the ocean, not just the seaweed you're trying to grow. Whereas for us on long lines, we don't have that issue. We seed our long lines, and the small amount of other seaweed grows on it. Because the Asparagopsis are the dominant species on that long line, it outcompetes the other species. So it's a safe and natural product. There are other methane reduction supplements available on the market. Boava being the main one, which is a chemical called 3-NOP. There was a huge amount of backlash earlier this year. Coles did a trial with Boava, and it's just the consumer backlash, the idea that beef and dairy products is going to have a chemical in it, was quite unpopular. So from a climate change perspective, I want all of these supplements to work. And I watched a pitch from one of the synthetic supplements, Ruminate. They were kind of saying why their supplement's so much better than Asparagopsis. But for us, we don't really need to defend it. Like Asparagopsis is the only one that's approved for use in Australia and Europe. It's safe. It's just a natural product that you're giving to the cows. So you don't have that perception of putting a chemical in there. So fortunately for us, I feel like we don't really have to defend against the synthetics. There's going to be room for them eventually, but I think Asparagopsis will be the dominant one, just being that natural product. Easy for farmers to use as well. They just, like I said, you can either add it at the seed supplier part of the value chain where it's blended in there, or you add it at the feed hopper part of where a feedlot or dairy cattle farmer mixes all their feed. They add other supplements in already, and then they just add the Asparagopsis in at that point. So environmental impact. So we looked at what a 32-hectare seaweed farm growing Asparagopsis seaweed could do versus a 32-hectare eucalyptus plantation. So something like 100 times more the abatement of methane versus the sequestration of carbon. So if we can have these large scale Asparagopsis seaweed farms up and down the coast, we're going to have the ability to reduce a large amount or abate a large amount of methane going into the atmosphere. So for us at scale, doing a 3,000 hectare lease that we're looking to do in the Northwest, that's something like 600,000 tons of CO2 equivalents per year. It's a nature-based solution, so we don't have a big environmental footprint. We're just letting what nature does best, which is grow seaweed in the ocean. There's other positive benefits from seaweed farming. You increase marine biodiversity whenever you put sort of sustainable aquaculture equipment in the water. It attracts fish. As soon as you start attracting fish and other marine life, you increase that biodiversity, and the greater the ocean biodiversity, the better the ocean is at drawing down carbon. It's a large market, Asparagopsis seaweed, to the cattle industry. So just feedlot and dairy cattle, and we looked at the known numbers. So we only know the feedlot and dairy numbers for the US, Europe, and Australia. We don't have data from China, which is probably the biggest feedlot market. We don't have it from India or Africa. So we've just based it on what we know, and that's about 50 million head of dairy and feedlot cattle. They would require over 1 million tons of the dry Asparagopsis seaweed product. And we looked at the Australian market as our SAM, the WA market as SOM. So currently, our 32 hectare seaweed farm can produce 64 tons of Asparagopsis and feed like minimum 2,800. That's based on our sort of what we can grow at the moment. But once we increase yields, it'll be up to 10,000 head of cattle. The 3,000 hectare lease could do 261,000 cows per year, which is similar. We're just being very conservative and saying the yields that we can currently achieve is that. But if we get up to higher yields, it'll be sort of about 5 times that amount. Yeah, like I said, it's a large market. So that 3,000 hectares will currently supply the WA feedlot and dairy sector, but it would also do about 20% of the Australian market, but only 1% of the global market. Asparagopsis seaweed, stable with a long shelf life. So when you process it, you spin it in a big industrial centrifuge, which is like a washing machine on spin dry. It spins off all the water. It goes from, say, if you harvest 10 kilos, you end up with about 1 kilo of Asparagopsis seaweed weight. We then freeze dry that to lock in the active compound, which is called bromoform, and that lasts for about a year as long as it's stored out of direct sunlight. Very lightweight and can be shipped around. So for the economics of Asparagopsis, it's complex because it's a brand new industry. We're trying to figure out what we can sell Asparagopsis seaweed for. So we figured out these 3 value drivers. So we've got the premiumization value that 1 in 4 consumers will potentially pay 15% more. It doesn't end up being a large part of it. It's something like 20 cents a kilo for the premiumization value. The second value driver is that feed conversion efficiency. So the cattle farmer needing 7% less feed to get the cow to the same weight. That's between $4 and $8. At the full 7%, it's $8 a kilo. To start with, we're forecasting cattle farms will only pay about $4 per kilo for that. Just they'll want to see the actual proof that they are getting that full 7% feed conversion improvement. The third one's the carbon credit or insetting value. So we're not relying on carbon credits as a business. We're building a sustainable business without that. As someone that's passionate about the environment and reducing greenhouse gas emissions, I don't like the idea of carbon credits supporting the big fossil fuel companies to continue in their ways. So it's an insetting value. It's basically we need to value that carbon. So when we look at it for a scope 3 emissions target, we can put a value on it. So we still do that as what a carbon credit would be valued. interestingly as well, there is an ACU methodology, an Australian Carbon Credit Unit methodology in the works, but it's not yet approved. But there is a voluntary um, carbon methodology for Asparagopsis or methane supplements that we can use. So that gets us um, somewhere between $1 and $9 a kilo for the carbon value of it. So we've created this value staircase. Our production costs between $3 and $6 a kilo. So um, going on our revenue and cost forecast, we're basing it on 2 ton per hectare flat yields, which is what we're currently able to do. We think we can get up to 10 tons a hectare once we really dial in our yields. And it's about optimizing the seed from this proposed seed facility and then having high quality seed material to grow out in the ocean. So the second pointer there is what we're looking at sales price. So we're only forecasting $4 a kilo to start with. Those early adopter cattle farmers that we're already talking to, we believe they only pay 50% of the feed conversion ratio, and we're not forecasting any carbon credit value in there or insetting value for Scope 3 emissions. 2028, once we've proved the 7% feed conversion benefit, we'll get that full $8 a kilo. And by 2030, we believe there'll be potential, pressures leading up to that sort of 2030 deadline that cattle farms will need to start looking at ways to reduce emissions and to really be able to reward the cattle farmer with some sort of credit or value of the carbon that they're abating or methane that they're abating. So that large scale facility I was talking about, 3,000 hectares, looking at $77 million annual revenue at $10 million annual costs. Aquaculture, fairly expensive to set everything up, less expensive than an onshore facility, but we have that fairly high cost as we start to scale that 3,000 hectares up, but it balances out once we come online. So for us, valuation, we have a seed round open at the moment, raising $10 million at a $20 million pre-money valuation. We have a really good team now, and there's one of our advisors, Jeff, got a background in economics, has been able to sort of try and figure out, the valuation based on our current yields and forecasting what 3 tons a hectare would look like, and then some of the other sort of sensitivities of sales price plus and minus 30%, capex and opex plus and minus 30%, which don't have a significant impact to our valuation. This is one where be looking to sort of really talk through a lot of these numbers in a lot more detail sort of once we get to that next stage. Like I said, got a great team now. Which is good because for a while there it was just me out in the boat trying to grow seaweed and then do all this stuff as well. So it's good that we've got a good team in place now. And I think that's it for me. Might have gone a little bit over time.
Chris, thank you so much for sharing. It's such an innovative solution to tackling climate change, and how interesting that you're tackling climate change from a boat in Fremantle. A lot of fun story as well. I'm going to now open it up to any questions.
I've got a question. Can I jump in?
Of course you can. I saw you come off
Oh,
mute.
great.
Thought this is going to be interesting. I'm curious.
No, I'm excited, Chris. It was really great presentation. And what you're doing is we followed it at a distance. We're seaweed aficionados over here at Good and Fugly. But I was just curious about something, just given our shared relationship to farmers. How do farmers take it in terms of changing feedstock and the like? Are you anticipating, I mean, you're obviously testing it with farmers, and you talked about that, but are you anticipating at scale kind of resistance? Like, what are the feedstocks that you're competing with? And you said it was a supplement, so maybe it's not as big an issue, but I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, so I mean, really, they're getting the same feedstock, and this is a supplement, but
Mm,
there's always going to be, a bit of pushback, I think, from farmers until they're comfortable with the product. So we've got the early adopters; they're very keen to use it, um, and it's something like, on that sort of bell curve of early adopters and then the early majority. Like once we get to that, we believe about 15 to 18% and start getting a decent amount to the early majority of cattle farmers, then you're away. So it's there needs to be the first movers and early adopters come through and prove that it's safe and effective against methane. It works really well. Get the feed conversion ratio to convince the wider cattle farming market.
right. Okay. So yeah, and just follow on from that. From a stable, you said it was stable up to a year. Are you adding stabilization? Are there other chemicals that have to be added at some point? And does that affect the efficacy? Do you know that yet?
No, there's different ways you can process it. You can dry it and then put it in oil, or you can dry it and freeze
Mm.
dry it like we're doing. Yeah, there's no other additives. It really is just pure seaweed.
Okay.
The reason for that is because there has been that pushback from consumers that they don't even seaweed in oil, because then you're removing the bromoform, it goes into solution with the oil, and then you're not really feeding the cow seaweed anymore. You're feeding them bromoform oil that's derived from seaweed. So we are
Mm,
just powdered up seaweed that we feed it, and yeah, there's no other additives to that.
okay, great.
Great question, Jonathan. Thank you. Are there any other questions?
I've got one. So if you're introducing Asparagopsis into like 3,000 hectares, I think you said up in the northwest, is there any danger of it being a introduced species into an environment and causing problems?
Yeah, it's a great question. Fortunately, it already grows up there. As part of our aquaculture lease and license, we have these conditions, and one of them is to do macroalgal monitoring. So macroalgal is seaweed. So we have to take a baseline. So we've done that here for our 32-hectare seaweed farm in Fremantle, where we take a baseline and we see all the different seaweeds that grow on local reefs. And then if we see a material increase in Asparagopsis, I think it's something like a 10% increase. We do this annual survey, then we have to report that. So, we've had the seaweed farm since 2022, going up to 3 years, and we'll be in 3 years in November, and we haven't seen any increase from our operations here. 3,000 hectares is a different story. Like they have to do the same thing, 3,000 hectares, but we have to make sure that by growing 3,000 hectares of Asparagopsis, then that doesn't just become, of that in that area, a dominant species that wasn't there before. We just have the environmental management practices in place to be able to monitor that. It's and as far as forecasters will say, if it will happen or won't, I would say it won't. And the reason for that is I was in South Korea last year where they grow nori at a huge scale. They're doing about 20,000 hectares of nori, and there's no increase in nori in the wild stocks, as a because of their farming nori at such a large scale, and they actually want to increase their wild stocks because it was so decimated leading up to aquaculture operations there, where people were harvesting wild caught or wild growing nori seaweed, and it stripped a lot of the ecosystems there. So even at such a large scale, it doesn't have an impact.
Okay, thanks. I've got another question. Just looking at your graph, maybe I've interpreted, but looking at graphs, it looks like it's taking. And what's the biggest driver to that? Why is it so slow?
Mac, it actually cut out a little for me then. So do you mind if we repeat the question?
Oh, sorry.
No, that's okay.
Yeah, I was saying, I was just looking at your graph, and it seems like there's about 5 years to get up to your full scale production. I don't know whether I interpret that the right way, but it looks like it. And so, what's driving that time frame? Why does it take so long to get to that scale of production? If you've got, if you had $10 million now, could you move faster, or would you need more money to move faster? What's holding back the pace?
I'd say, yeah, it's growing it in a sustainable way. So we need the seed facility first. That'll take about a year to build and then get fully operational. Then we need to do that, like I said, that baseline survey for the northwest area. That probably takes about a year as well. And we'll start with 160 hectares in the northwest. The reason for that is just um, instead of applying for 3,000 hectares straight up, we just want to make sure we can get it to work at 160 hectares first and then scale up to the 3,000 beyond that. There's just also a lot of equipment to put in. So, to grow seaweed, we install anchors, chain and ropes and floats in the ocean. So it's pretty simple gear, but there would be a lot of it. It would take a while to install enough equipment for 3,000 hectares. I'd say at least a year. Up there with cyclone season, you can kind of only operate for about 6 months of the year. You can grow seaweed through the cyclone season though. Just have to make sure you've got big enough anchors to withstand it.
Okay. Guess I'm being greedy, wanting you to get it done faster so you get the outcome faster.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, I guess, I think aquaculture in particular is a fairly long play. Like it takes a while to scale things up because you're growing living things. I mean, I'd say farming's probably similar, right? To set up, say a 3,000 hectare wheat farm, like it probably wouldn't be within a year to, clear the land and then seed it and get it operational. It would take a few years, but we have different constraints to that. Mostly it's equipment, getting equipment ready and seed supply.
Thanks.
I've got a question for you, Chris. I just wondered how you're positioning Fremantle Seaweed within the global methane reduction and climate tech landscape. I know that's an emerging landscape, and also, how you're differentiating yourself from competitors in that.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, so there's the synthetic products. The only one that's approved for use is that Boa product I was talking about. I think the advantage of Asparagopsis seaweed is a natural product, so you don't have that same consumer perception that you're feeding the cow a chemical. So that's really our advantage there, the fact that it's a natural product, and then also the way we produce it. It's ocean grown, letting nature do what nature does best. Growing seaweed in the ocean, we don't have the high input costs. Don't have to add fertilizers or anything like that. There's no inputs to growing our seaweed. It just naturally grows in the ocean. So I think it's very much, it's like a nature-based climate solution by growing seaweed and then offsetting or abating the cattle methane. I would say that's our advantage in the global methane markets.
Amazing, thank you. Well, that's a wrap for today. Is there any other questions before I wrap it up? Thank you so much, Chris, for sharing that with us. And thank you so much to Good and Fugly and Fremantle Seaweed for sharing some very innovative approaches for tackling global problems and some very exciting investment opportunities.